So atheism is the affirmation that the claim that God exists is false. So the atheist is saying that when you say God exists, that is not true. That's his affirmation. So the atheist is making an assertion. He's making an affirmation, right? And what that means is that since he's making an assertion, as we learned in our lessons on argumentation, if he's making an affirmation, if he's making an assertion, then he has a burden of proof. Anybody who makes a claim or makes an assertion has a burden of proof for that claim or that assertion. So when I say God exists, then I bear a burden of proof for that. I'm responsible to give some evidence that God exists. Similarly, the atheist, when he makes the assertion, when he makes the claim God does not exist, bears a burden of proof, okay? He is obliged, at least in principle, to give some kind of reason or evidence for the non-existence of God. And we'll explore that a little bit more here in a minute. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. We are in still in our worldviews module. We've been looking at worldviews for the last several lessons. We've looked at theism. We've looked at deism. We spent a couple weeks thinking about Islam, and we have a couple lessons left. Today we want to talk about naturalism and atheism, which are, as you'll see, really two different things, but they, as I like to say, they're kind of fellow travelers. They go together quite a bit, and so we'll look at them together. And then next week we're going to look at kind of a general category that includes many of your Eastern religions and Gnosticism, early Christian heresy, and some things like that. A general category that I call monism. Sometimes people call it oneism. So we'll look at those next week. As far as your resources are concerned, of course, there's Sire's book again there. Frank Turk has a really good book called Stealing from God. It's not about tithes and offerings, but it's about how atheists borrow theistic ideas for their worldview. So it's called Stealing from God. Al Mohler has a fairly recent it's just a little book called Atheism Remix, in which he looks at what's called the new atheism. So beginning about 20 years ago, you had the development of a kind of a new, aggressive, very militant type of atheism. Guys like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and people like that who were very aggressive and very militant in their atheism. And so he addresses that phenomena. Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, which I believe we've talked about before, talks about some of the problems with naturalistic thinking. And then there's this book, The Future of Atheism, which is it's edited by a Christian fellow, Stewart, but it's actually a dialogue between atheists and Christians. So it's various chapters, or some chapters are written by atheists and some chapters are written by Christians. So that's very interesting and informative. Thomas Nagel's book I've referred to before. He himself is an atheist, but he also points out some of the problems with the naturalistic philosophy as it's related to Darwinism. And then I have a paper that I did about 10 years ago or so on the subject of naturalism that's available on the class website on the resources page. So those are just some resources that are available to you. So when we're talking about atheism, of course, the word itself, the root word there is theism, which of course is belief in God, with the prefix a or a, which means without, so without belief in God. But that in itself is a little bit vague, because atheism is really distinct from what we might think of as just simple skepticism or agnosticism. So skepticism would be the idea or the thought that I doubt that God exists. So the person's not particularly convinced that God doesn't exist. They just doubt that He exists. Okay, and then agnosticism comes from the word gnosis or gnostic, which means to know, and again the prefix a means without knowledge, not knowing. Okay, so the agnostic is somebody who says, I don't know if God exists. So they really, their idea is they just don't have enough information to know whether or not God exists. And also among agnostics, you'll get some who say it's not possible to know if God exists. So they're not saying He doesn't exist. They're not saying He does exist. Okay, both of those, skepticism and agnosticism, are different from atheism. Okay. So, according to the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy or Encyclopedia of Philosophy, atheism is the belief that the proposition God exists is false. Okay? So remember that within philosophy, a proposition is the reality behind the words. Okay? So if I make a statement, it's snowing out, okay, then the proposition is that the reality of it's snowing outside. Okay? So atheism is the belief that when we say God exists, He does not really exist. Okay? So it's the belief that God does not exist, put more simply. Okay? So oftentimes what you'll get from atheists is they'll say, in an effort to try to avoid having to defend their position, they will sometimes say, well, I just have a lack of belief in God. But that is not what atheism is. Atheism is not a lack of belief in God, because both the skeptic and the agnostic lack belief in God, but they are not atheists. They are not saying God does not exist. All right? So atheism is the affirmation that the claim that God exists is false. So the atheist is saying that when you say God exists, that is not true. That's his affirmation. So the atheist is making an assertion. He's making an affirmation, right? And what that means is that since he's making an assertion, as we learned in our lessons on argumentation, if he's making an affirmation, if he's making an assertion, then he has a burden of proof. Anybody who makes a claim or makes an assertion has a burden of proof for that claim or that assertion. So when I say God exists, then I bear a burden of proof for that. I'm responsible to give some evidence that God exists. Similarly, the atheist, when he makes the assertion, when he makes the claim God does not exist, bears a burden of proof. Okay, he is obliged, at least in principle, to give some kind of reason or evidence for the non-existence of God, and we'll explore that a little bit more here in a minute. But before we do, I want to think about a verse in Psalm that you're probably familiar with, you've probably thought about. Actually, it's in a couple places in Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are virtually identical Psalms. And verse 1 in Psalm 14 says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Okay, and I think oftentimes we get the wrong impression from that verse. We read things into it that aren't there. That I want you to notice what's the subject of that sentence? A little grammar here. The fool is the subject. Okay, so the atheist is not the subject, or the one who doesn't believe in God is not the subject, right? The subject of the sentence is the fool. Okay, so you'll see why this is important. So in the Old Testament, the word, when the word fool is used, particularly as it is here in Psalms and as it frequently is in the book of Proverbs, it's used in reference to a person's moral character. It's not a reference to their intellectual capacity, okay? So when Proverbs talks about the fool, it's not talking about somebody who's stupid, all right? When Proverbs talks about the fool, it's not talking about somebody who's somehow cognitively impaired, right? It's talking about somebody with some kind of moral deficiency, right? So the fool is not, in the Old Testament, the fool is not one who doesn't reason or who is unable to reason. That's not what the word means, but rather it's a person who reasons wrongly, all right? So he's not incapable of reason, he's not stupid, he's not mentally impaired in some way, he just reasons wrongly. And if you've had much experience at all with atheists, you'll recognize this is true. The first real atheist that I ever knew was when I was in high school. And he lived just right up the street from me. And so we were in the same grade together. And so we used to walk back and forth from school together oftentimes, or we'd drive one another back. I'd ride with him. Sometimes he would ride with me or whatever. And he was an atheist, and the guy was a whole lot smarter than I was. He certainly got better grades than I did in high school, I can tell you that much. But he was an atheist. But he could certainly reason circles around me in certain ways. So the fool in Scripture is one who casts off the fear of God. We see that very clear in Proverbs. In Proverbs, the fool is somebody who's casting off the fear of God. They want to live free of God. They want to live independently of God, right? So when we think about that then, the atheist is not one who is mentally deficient. The verse is not telling us that the person who is an atheist is somehow mentally deficient. He's a fool. So it's not saying the atheist is a fool. It's saying the fool says in his heart there is no God. All right. So he's not mentally deficient. He's not stupid. That sort of thing. But instead, he's one who has made a moral choice to live as though God didn't exist. Okay, he's made a moral choice to live independent of God and to ignore God in his life, or to forget God. So when you think about that, then what that means really is that we really have kind of two kinds of atheists. All right, so we have what we might call the metaphysical atheist. So the metaphysical atheist is the one who explicitly claims or explicitly believes God does not exist. All right? But think about the book of Psalms and the book of Proverbs when it talks about the fool. Those books were written in a Jewish context, right? They were written in the context of Jews. They were written for Jews, on behalf of Jews. So in other words, they were written in a context in which everybody believed in God, right? So who is he talking about? Who is he talking about here if everybody in the context in which the passage is written has some form of belief in the existence of God? Well, that would bring up then the other kind of atheist. And this would be what I would call the practical atheist. So the practical atheist would be someone who kind of tacitly acknowledges God's existence. They say God exists. They might go to church. They might perform certain religious rituals or duties or whatever, okay? But when it really comes down to it, they live their lives as though God didn't exist. They live their lives independent of God. That's the fool. The fool is the person who lives his life independent of God, whether or not he believes God exists. So he may believe God exists, he may go to church and sit in the pew on Sunday, and then he goes home and he lives the rest of his week in just totally ignoring God. That would be what I would call a practical atheist, okay? But in our study today, as we're talking about atheism, we're talking about the first one. So we're not talking about the practical atheist. That's the guy that we talk about in most of our Bible studies and sermons and all that sort of thing, how to live in submission to and in recognition of God. But in our study of apologetics, we want to focus here on the first one, which is the person who overtly denies the existence of God. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how does the atheist argue for his or her position? Why does the atheist say there is no God? And I think what you'll find is there are just a handful of reasons that we might think of as affirmative arguments for atheism. Okay, there are only a handful of reasons that the atheist will give. Will say, this leads me to the conclusion that God does not exist. This ought to lead you to the conclusion that God does not exist. And the first one of those is one we've talked about in considerable depth already, which is the problem of evil, right? So oftentimes the atheist will say the existence of evil is evidence that a theistic God does not exist. Logically, he cannot exist. And of course, we explored that, and we've seen that virtually all philosophers today recognize that that's not a valid argument. Okay, so the problem of evil, the argument from the problem of evil against the existence of God, has been demonstrated to fail. But in addition to that, another reason this argument fails is because, as we've mentioned several times, the existence of evil is actually evidence for the existence of God, right? If you believe evil exists, you have to have some objective measure of good, right? And you can't have that without a God. If all we have is just a natural world without a God, then there is no good and evil. Things just are, okay? So the problem of evil is actually an argument for the existence of God. The second argument that you will sometimes run into is one we also mentioned. We mentioned a few weeks ago when we were talking about monotheism, is this idea that religion evolves. So the atheist may say to you, well, God doesn't exist. Religion and religious belief and belief in God is just something that evolved as humans evolved. For some reasons, humans just felt the need for survival. Somehow this belief in God aided in their survival, and so they believed in God. And so the idea is this evolutionary development of religion from the very primitive religions to eventually monotheism. And of course, we looked at that when we talked about monotheism, and we saw, first of all, there is no evidence for that kind of evolutionary development of religion. And in fact, the evidence we do have from archaeology and anthropology and ethnology, the evidence that we do have actually points to original monotheism. Okay, so the evidence we do have doesn't reveal this kind of progression, this evolutionary progression of religious faith, but that in the earliest primitive tribes there existed this original monotheism. So that's one problem with it. But the other problem with this argument is it commits what's called the genetic fallacy. Okay, so the genetic fallacy is the fallacy that assumes that the reason a belief originated is reason to know whether or not it's true or false. So, for example, and you may have heard this used before, somebody may have said to you, well, the only reason you believe in Christianity is because you were born in America, right? If you'd been born in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you'd been born in Southeast Asia, you'd be a Buddhist, you know. The only reason you believe in Christianity is because you're born in America. Well, that may be true. You know, somebody could say to me, the only reason, Rick, you believe in Christianity is because you learned it on your mother's knee, right? And there was a point in my life when that was true. That was the only reason I believed in Christianity, is because I learned it from my parents. Did that make it true or false? It didn't, did it, right? So the origin of belief is not an argument for or against its truthfulness, right? And so the problem with this argument is, even if religious belief did develop from some kind of evolutionary process, that doesn't tell you whether it's true or not, right? That doesn't speak to the truth of it. So that argument commits what's called the genetic fallacy. The third argument, which again you hear over and over again, is I don't believe in Christianity because of all the evil that religious people do. And Christians have done terrible things in the past. And of course, you know, we'd have to admit that's true. Christians have, in the past, done some very terrible things. Is that evidence that Christianity isn't true? Of course it's not. And here again, we have another fallacy, another what's called an informal fallacy, right? And this particular fallacy is called the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is the Latin to the man, okay? And the ad hominem fallacy is the fallacy where a person, where somebody arguing attacks the person or the character of the person on the assumption that if you can attack the person, the character of the person, that disproves what that person believes, which of course there's no necessary connection between those two things, all right? So it's the ad hominem fallacy. The character of a person does not prove or disprove what they believe. So we've had a very unfortunate example of this in just the recent weeks with the case of Ravi Zacharias, right? So Ravi Zacharias is outstanding Christian apologist, world famous Christian apologist, and has just done superb work in the area of Christian apologetics and spoken all over the world and had tremendous influence with people. And then he passed away here recently, and then shortly after he passed away, it was discovered that he had been involved in all kinds of ongoing immorality over many, many years. Okay? So, now we know something terrible and unfortunate about Ravi Zacharias' character. Does that validate all that he believed or that he said he believed? Of course it doesn't. There's no connection between those two, right? So that's the ad hominem argument. Now, so those are probably, at least as from my perspective, those are really about the only arguments for atheism, actually for atheism, that you're likely to encounter. There may be some others, but those are the biggies, all right? Almost every other argument an atheist makes is an argument against your arguments for theism, right? So in other words, he's going to say, well, the reason I believe that God doesn't exist is because you haven't convinced me that he does, right? So what they do then is they argue against your arguments for theism. So what that means is one of the best ways for us to be equipped to deal with an atheist is to know our arguments well, so that when they object to our arguments or whatever, we have answers for them. Now, we've talked about a number of arguments for the existence of God, and I was just given a book recently that was on my wish list, but I was just given a book recently with a compilation of essays by over 20 different philosophers, each one writing on a different argument for the existence of God. So there's like 20 arguments. I haven't gotten into the book yet. It's still there on my shelf, and it's on my waiting list. But so there are a number of different arguments. You don't have to know all of them, all right? But if you just know 2 or 3 arguments and you learn them fairly well, then you're going to be in a position to deal well with the atheist. Because really, for many of them, their argument is, your argument doesn't persuade me, right? And so the better the more thoroughly we know our own arguments, whether we like 1 argument or 2 arguments or 3 arguments or whatever, the better we know our arguments, the better positioned we are to talk with our friends and neighbors and family members who are atheists, okay? But you need to be careful, because atheists sometimes will throw you a curve, okay? And you'll see this a lot if you're on social media or on YouTube or whatever, and you interact with atheists or you see atheists interacting, you're going to encounter these. And one of them is the frequent claim that atheists make is, if there were a God, he would do such and such in such and such situation. So I think on 2 or 3 cases where I've either heard the testimony of an atheist or I've read their testimony of how they became atheists, 2 or 3 times at least I've encountered this particular argument where they've said, well, you know, I was a child, I was growing up, and my mother or somebody I really loved got really deathly sick, And I believed in God, and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed that God would heal them, and He didn't heal them, and they died. So my mother died, and at that point I became an atheist. And there's actually a number of atheists who have stories like that, okay? So what they're saying was, in a particular situation, if God exists, I know He would have done this. He would have heard my prayers, and He would have healed my mother, right? And because my mother wasn't healed, I know God didn't exist. So sometimes you'll get that, you'll get that argument from them. But the problem with that argument, of course, is that argument is a theological assertion, right? It's an assertion about what a God, if He existed, what that God would do in a particular situation. But the question is, what basis does the atheist have to make a theological affirmation about a God and what a God would do in a situation? What is the basis that the atheist has to say, if there was a God, He would have healed my mother? What's the basis for that? And as it turns out, apart from revelation and faith, there's really no way that we as finite beings can ever know for certain what a omniscient, infinite, omnipotent, perfectly wise, perfectly good God would do in a particular situation. So this just goes back to the problem of evil as we talked about it, right? How do we know what God would do in a situation? We assume that the best thing for God to do in a situation is to do this, and if He doesn't do this, there must not be a God. But in reality, there's no way for us to know that. How many times in your life, and certainly it's happened many times in my life, where I've seen a situation, I've made a decision to do something, I've done that thing, and then later it turned out it was the wrong thing to do. Anybody ever had that happen, right? And the reason it happens is because there's other information we don't have, right? There's something we don't know when we make the decision. And we make the decision and things go screwy, and we go, well, I didn't know that. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have done this, right? And so what the fallacy here, the problem here, is the person is assuming that they have sufficient wisdom and goodness to know what God would do. All right? So don't get thrown off by that point. Then another one, and I've seen some really smart, brilliant atheists do this, okay? Is I don't need to give evidence for the existence of God, because everybody knows you can't prove a negative, right? I mean, how many times have you heard that? You can't prove a negative. How many times have you said it? You can't prove a negative. Well, it turns out it's just simply not true. It's not true that you can't prove a negative, right? At least it's possible to prove negatives beyond a reasonable doubt. So, for example, if I were to say to you, there's no elephant in this room, okay? There's no elephant in this room. And you say, well, prove to me there's no elephant in this room. And I say to you, well, I'm sorry, I can't prove negative. You'll just have to take my word for it. You go, wait a minute, you can prove to me there's no elephant in this room. I can give you sufficient evidence that any reasonable person would conclude there's no elephant in this room, right? So it is possible to prove a negative. Now that one's pretty easy, but I could also say, well, there is no star orbiting the Earth. Well, now I'm not an astronomer, of course, so you might wonder what my expertise level is, but I could probably give most of you sufficient evidence that you would be convinced, or at least persuaded, that there's no star orbiting the Earth, right? So it isn't true that you can't prove a negative, right? Under the right circumstances. Now again, remember, we're not saying you prove it to absolute certainty. We've already established in our lessons on epistemology about the impossibility, or at least the near impossibility, of absolute certainty about anything. But certainly I can prove many negatives beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So don't let the atheists throw that at you. Second thing, or another point I want to make, is that when the atheist says to you, I'm not convinced by your argument, so you give them some arguments for theism, whatever they may be, you give them some reasons why you believe in God, and they say, well, I'm just not convinced of your argument. There's certain things to keep in mind when they say that. One is, that is not a rebuttal, that's not a refutation, that doesn't disprove your argument. Right? So just because you've not persuaded somebody doesn't mean that your argument is false or that the thing you're trying to persuade them to is false. It just means they haven't been persuaded. Right? So if I give somebody my best argument and they say, well, I'm sorry, that doesn't persuade, I'm just not persuaded by that. Now, it may be that my best argument isn't very good, so it probably would behoove me to go back and kind of think it through and make sure I've given a good argument. But it doesn't necessarily mean I may have given them a superb argument. People believe and accept arguments for all kinds of different reasons, right? So when someone says to you, your argument's not persuasive, that is not evidence that what you're arguing for is not true. And in fact, it's not even evidence that your argument isn't a very good, solid argument. It may be. They just weren't persuaded, all right? But also, the fact that your argument didn't persuade them is not proof that their position is right. Right? So if I'm arguing for the existence of God and I give a terrific argument and they're not persuaded, well, that doesn't make atheism true just because they weren't persuaded. Right? So when someone's not persuaded by your argument, don't let that throw you. It does behoove you maybe to go back and kind of rethink your argument and think, okay, did I do it well or not? But if you're convinced you've done it well, or if you see some better ways to do it, fine. But that's not an evidence for atheism. And it's not evidence against theism. Okay? So just keep that in mind. So now I want to go on and I want to talk about naturalism. But when you think about, okay, what's the difference between atheism and naturalism? Well, atheism, as we've seen, is a belief, a specific belief about somebody's belief in God or non-belief in God, belief that God doesn't exist. So atheism is a theological belief, all right, or we might say a philosophical belief. Naturalism, on the other hand, refers to one's kind of overall view of reality. So naturalism is a worldview. So atheism is a theological belief. Naturalism is a worldview. Now, your naturalistic worldview may incorporate atheism, okay? But atheism would only be one part of that world. It may be a very influential part of that worldview, but it would only be part of that worldview, okay? So, in theory at least, one could be a naturalist and not be an atheist. Somebody could hold a kind of a general view that would be generally be called naturalism, although there might be some fine points that they wouldn't go along with. But they would be generally a naturalist, but they're not an atheist, okay? They might be a deist. They might even be a Christian, okay? I think René Descartes may be an example. I'm not an expert on Descartes, but he may be an example of a Christian who was a naturalist. So, on the other hand, it doesn't seem likely that one could be an atheist without being a naturalist. So you could be a naturalist without being an atheist, perhaps, but I don't know how you could be an atheist without being a naturalist, at least on some level. What kind of what am I talking about when I'm talking about naturalist? Because actually this word is used in several different ways, so let's clarify that. The word has often been used historically just to refer to somebody who's really into nature, okay? So you have somebody who invests a lot of their time and effort, maybe even their career is invested in studying nature and in going out and studying plants and wildlife and that sort of thing. Or you have some naturalists who were famous photographers or famous artists of nature, and they would go out and they would paint landscapes and wildlife and that sort of thing. I have a brother who's very into birds, and he just amazes me. He can walk through a wooded area. I suppose it is rooted, but he walked through a wooded area and he just hears a bird and he can tell you what kind of bird it is. He can identify them by their song and that sort of thing. So in that respect, my brother's kind of a naturalist, okay? So that's one way the word is used. Another way the word is used is in reference to ontological naturalism, okay, which is a philosophy, the philosophy of naturalism. And Moreland and Craig define naturalism in this way: reality is exhausted by the spatio-temporal world of physical objects, accessible in some way to the senses and embraced by our best scientific theories. There is nothing which is not accessible to the senses. So in other words, naturalism believes that all there is are those things which are accessible to our senses, to sight, sound, taste, touch, feel, that sort of thing, okay? You know, we might need the addition, we might need some superpowered microscope or whatever to see it, but if we had a strong enough microscope, we could see an atom or a neutron or whatever, okay? So, or we could some way sense it, we could measure it, that sort of thing with our scientific instruments, okay? So everything is contained within this, what they call the natural world. So that would be ontological naturalism. Then there's something called methodological naturalism, and this is something we'll look at in more detail and explore in more detail here in a couple, 3 weeks or so when we get into our science module. But a methodological naturalist is one who employs only naturalism in his method of doing his research or doing his science, okay? So whether he's a physicist or a biologist or a chemist or a historian or an archaeologist or a psychiatrist or whatever, he employs only naturalism. So it's a method of practicing science or practicing academic research in which one precludes any consideration of any non-natural explanations of causation, okay? So as I'm doing my science, whether I'm doing my physics or I'm doing my history or whatever I'm doing, as I'm doing it, I am saying the only thing I can consider as a cause of events that happen are natural causes. I preclude any unnatural or non-material causes, okay? It's called methodological naturalism. Now, it's possible for a person to be a Christian, even a very strong Christian, and be a methodological naturalist. So, and there are many scientists like this who are, they're scientists, but they're Christian scientists, but in their practicing the method of their science, in the way they approach science, they say, well, I can't ever, in doing science, I can't ever consider anything other than natural causes. I cannot consider the possibility of miracles. So in my religious belief, I may believe miracles happen, but in my science or in my history, I can't ever consider that as an explanation. Okay. So for example, I'm reading a book right now by a gentleman who's a kind of a sociologist historian, okay? And I've read a lot of him in the past. He's very informative, and I find a lot of benefit from reading him. But it's very, and the book I'm reading right now is on the history of Christianity. And one of the things that's fascinating about this book is, though the guy teaches at at least a quasi-Christian university, and I think that at least nominally the guy's a Christian. I don't know that he is, born again or whatever, but I think at least nominally he's a Christian. In his history, it's obvious as he writes his kind of sociological historical study of Christianity, he precludes any non-material, any divine cause of anything that happened in history. He tries to explain it all through natural causes. Okay, so that's methodological naturalism. Now we're going to look at methodological naturalism in some depth when we get into our science module, because that's where we encounter it. And we're going to ask ourselves, is that a legitimate way to do science? Okay, so we'll look at that in a coming lesson. But But what we're talking about today is ontological naturalism. Okay, so that's what we're wrestling with today, this kind of worldview of naturalism. Now, naturalism is more so today than at any point in the history of mankind. Naturalism is a very strong, dominant worldview. Okay, we encounter it everywhere. Your children in school, if they're in public school, they encounter it. You encounter it when you go to the movies. You encounter it when you open the newspaper or you're turning on your computer. You're just constantly encountering. How did we get here? Because it wasn't always this way. It wasn't always this way. So how did we get from where we were, where people viewed the world with a strong sense of the existence of God and God's activity in the world, and that history had some kind of divine purpose to it? How did we get from that to naturalism? And there were a series of events that are particularly influential, probably many more than this, but several that are particularly influential in beginning to shape and move us in this direction. And the first was the Renaissance, which typically we think of in the 14th, 15th, maybe the early 16th century. And what you have in the Renaissance, and we'll look a little bit at the Renaissance when we get into our history module, but what you have in the Renaissance is you have this period of very exciting progress, partly in the fields of art and that sort of thing, but primarily in the field of science and discovery and that sort of thing. So the Copernican view of the rotation of the planets and things like that are all discovered during this Renaissance period, okay? And so what this led to is particularly among the elites and the educated, it led to an increased confidence in human reason, because we just got much more confident about what we could discover just by reasoning and thinking and research and acquiring evidence and that sort of thing. And then following the Renaissance, you have the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And what happens in the Protestant Reformation is, up until that time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, in Europe particularly, you had this kind of monolithic authority of the church. And the church told you what was true, what reality was, and what you should believe. And you get the Protestant Reformation comes along, and it successfully challenges that, okay? And it says, wait a minute, okay? The church is wrong sometimes. There are some things the church has told you that aren't true, and there are some things that you haven't been told the church didn't tell you that are true, okay? And so this monolithic authority of Rome is successfully challenged, and then over the next 100 years or so, you get a period of what are referred to, and we'll look at this in our history module. It's kind of a misnomer, but this period of what's called religious wars. So you get 100 years of what are called religious wars, and this raises in people's minds the question of the merits of religious belief, okay, which were never really questioned, at least not in mass or among the elites before this time, okay? So then, if Rome could be challenged, if you could challenge the authority of Rome, then why can't you challenge also the authority of the Bible? Okay, so this begins to develop partly as a product of the Reformation. And then we move into the period of Enlightenment, and this is where this kind of naturalist philosophy really begins to blossom and flower. And so in the 17th and 18th centuries you get the Enlightenment, and what you get is you get a shift in authority where previously the idea of knowledge and how we know things is revelation. Okay, that's preeminent. God's revelation to us through Scripture primarily. Okay, and that is accompanied by reason, human reason, which is important for discovering knowledge, but is subservient to revelation. Okay, revelation is preeminent, and human reason and rationality is an important element of discovery, but it comes under revelation as far as authority is concerned. And what you get is you get a reversal of that. Okay, So then during the Enlightenment, you'll get this kind of shift where human reasoning begins to replace revelation as the ultimate authority. So what you get then is you get a period of just real destabilization in intellectual circles, in religious beliefs, and that sort of thing. Just a tremendous period of destabilization, and then that affects things like society and politics and all that sort of thing. Okay. So during the Enlightenment, you get this flowering of naturalism, and there are some key figures in this, and these are just a few, just to give you an idea. Okay. And early in the Enlightenment, in the early part of the Enlightenment, most of these Enlightenment thinkers were Christians, at least nominally, and some of them very strong Christians. All right. So, for example, I mentioned René Descartes. Okay, and he's famous. You know him from "I Think, Therefore I Am." Okay, and actually, that was a pretty profound discovery he made when he got to that point. But we don't have time to talk about that. But actually, that whole "I think, therefore I am" thing is reflective of Descartes' influence on society, and that he moved society to a very strong, actually an extreme form of rationalism. Now, he's a believer, he was a Christian, but he moved thinkers and ideas and philosophy in this direction of very strong, extreme rationalism. And one of the things he did that was significant is that he made mind, remember we talked about mind as opposed to body when we talked about the nature of humanness, and we talked about it as two distinct realities. Well, he made mind, in his thinking, the mind was actually a subcategory of matter rather than being independent of matter. It's a subcategory. That's a significant shift. Okay, and then John Locke. He was another theist, and remember we had reason. We had revelation over reason. What John Locke did is he switched those, and he said, no, reason is on top of revelation. Now, it's God-given. God gives us our reason and gives us our ability to reason, and it has authority over revelation. All right? So he makes the shift that I've been talking about. Okay? Then as you go on later in the Enlightenment, and particularly thinking of the French Enlightenment is where you really get a lot of this. There are actually kind of three elements of the Enlightenment. There's the French element, there's the British element, and there's the American element. So you get kind of three centers, and they really were three, in some sense, different enlightenments. Okay, so particularly here, you have among the French and the Swiss, you have guys like Voltaire and Rousseau, Lamettrie, and you have a group of philosophers in France called the French philosophes, okay? And these guys typically then were not Christians. They typically tended to be deists, and some of them even were atheists. And okay, so we've got Locke, who's got revelation down here, and he's got reason up here, but it's God-given. And what these guys do is they just do away with the God-given. So now what we've just got is autonomous human reason, totally without God. Okay, so this is all happening during the Enlightenment. So during the Enlightenment, there's a number of ideas that become prevalent, and one of them is that human reason is all you need in order to know things. Anything that's knowable can be known through human reason. Revelation is completely out of the picture. You get, particularly again with the French Enlightenment, you get an overt assault on religion. Okay, particularly Christianity as it's expressed through Catholicism, because of course French was predominantly Catholic. So you get a lot of criticism of the abuses that religions engage in, particularly Christianity. You get very overt attacks upon the Bible, its credibility, its authority, and you just get a lot of just mythical caricature of Christianity, of the history of Christianity. So guys like Voltaire and Rousseau and these guys, they painted a picture of Christianity in the past that's completely mythological. Okay. And historians today recognize that. But the problem is that many of the myths that people learned from the Enlightenment are still being taught today in our schools, are believed in society. There are many things that I was taught in school about Christianity and history. They're just completely false. The whole idea of a Dark Ages, you know, you've all heard about the Dark Ages, did not exist, okay? The fall of Rome is blamed on Christians. Christians were responsible for the fall of Rome and then for plunging society, Western society, into the Dark Ages. That's all myth. So just a number of caricatures of Christianity that grew out of the Enlightenment and are still believed today by many people, and you'll hear them today. So what you had going on is what's called, in the Enlightenment, is what some writers have called the Enlightenment Project. And the Enlightenment Project was, we're going to dispose of superstition. What they meant by that is we're going to dispose of religious beliefs, okay? We're going to throw religion aside, we're going to dispose of it, and we're going to found society on this philosophy that's based completely on rational inquiry, empirical evidence, scientific discovery. That's how we're going to learn things. Anything that can be learned will be learned this way, and we're just going to do away with all this superstitious stuff. This is the Enlightenment Project, sometimes referred to as, modernism. Well, that led to some disasters. And so towards the end of the Enlightenment period, then you start getting this Enlightenment Project idea begins to fade. And one of the first things that really dealt it a significant blow was the French Revolution. So you get the French Revolution, which in contrast to the American Revolution, which comes just a few years after the American Revolution, you get this horrific, violent, brutal revolution, okay? And the reason for the violence and the brutality of the French Revolution is rooted to some degree in this hyper-rationalism of the Enlightenment. And to the degree that still that modernist experiment was still existed in society, so by the early part of the 20th century, you still had a great deal of optimism. We're going to create this utopian world. We can do this, folks. We just need to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And then they ran into the reality of World War I. And that just took the air out of that whole Enlightenment project. But what it didn't do was it didn't erase this whole naturalistic philosophy, okay? So naturalism still becomes entrenched in certain minds, and then by the middle of the 19th century, of course, you have the publication of The Origin of the Species. And as I mentioned before, that gives naturalism its story. It gives us its mega narrative that we've talked about, okay? So now we can say not only the world, all there is nature, but now we can explain it. Now we can explain how it happened and it all evolved without any God, without any miracles, without any intelligent design, etc., okay? So that's the post-Enlightenment era. And still the idea that naturalism persists through that and actually then begins to grow and explode after Darwin. So we have then, in the time we have left, and we may not have time to go through all these points, but you have them in your notes. Just using Sire's 8 questions again that he uses to explore worldviews. In naturalism, ultimate reality is just the cosmos. So Carl Sagan put it best. He said the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Okay, that's it. Just the cosmos. Okay, so it's ultimate reality. So naturalism denies the existence of a non-natural reality. There are some exceptions to that among naturalists, but in general that's true. So the cosmos then is a closed system. There's nothing beyond the cosmos that can influence the cosmos or interact or whatever. So in other words, there's no God out there that can influence the cosmos at all. But the question then, of course, would be, well, how could one ever know that there's no reality beyond that which is accessible to the 5 senses? If the only thing I can know is what's I have access to in my five senses, then how could I ever say that there's nothing else out there? If I've limited myself to say I can only know this, then there could be something out there that I've said I can't know, and I've limited myself so I can't know it. Okay? So how could I ever know that? Humanness. Humans are, again, just complex physical matter and energy, and consciousness and our thoughts they're just basically the secretions of our physical brain. So they're not independent of our brain, but they just kind of emanate, or they're an epiphenomena of our physical brain. And you might conclude then that atheists and particularly naturalists would say, well, humans then are insignificant, and there are many who do. They say there's no significance to humanity. But there are many who believe that humans are very significant. But that significance is based upon, not as we do, we base it upon the fact we're created by God and that we bear the imago Dei. Okay. To them, significance is that we are just simply the highest form of evolved form. We're the highest evolved form, right? So we have self-consciousness, we have those things, but that's all a product of evolution. And so we're significant because in one sense, we're the best that evolution has produced so far, right? But then the question we would ask ourselves is what happens when we're out-evolved? Because according to Darwinism, if there's enough time, we are going to be the apes compared to somebody else, right? We're going to be the lesser form. Something else is going to evolve, right? So do we lose our significance then? And then the question is, how does random, undirected change instill significance? How does the fact that I'm the furthest advanced, supposedly, depending on how you measure advancement, I'm the furthest advanced, but that's still a product of random mutations, wild. So how does that instill significance? In fact, what is significance? What is significance itself? Okay. What is death? Of course, death is simply annihilation, and the only thing about you that's going to go on after death, of course, are your atoms and your molecules that will go on and go into a tree or a rock or some other person or whatever, right? How do we know anything? Well, we're capable of knowing all there is to know, again, through our innate, autonomous reason. But then again, how do we know that? We've limited our capacity to know. So consciousness, our thinking abilities, our values, all of that stuff has evolved, right? Number 6, what is the source of ethics and morals? Of course, ethics and morals are just the product of the evolutionary process. And so here's the thing we need to realize about this, the impact that evolution has on morals. Okay, so morality is evolving. And if morality is evolving, that means that the moral norms that are acceptable today, that are different from those that were acceptable 100 years ago, are better, right? Because they've evolved. They enhance survivability. So transgenderism, gay marriage, abortion, okay, all of those things are an improvement, an evolutionary advancement from the things we used to believe 50 or 100 years ago. So that's why many people think the way they do. They think, well, if it's new, it's better. And the reason I think that is because I believe Darwinism. I believe in this process of random mutation and natural selection and survival of the fittest. Okay? So new trends in morality are by definition superior to the old ways of doing things. So they are subjective rather than objective. And atheism and naturalism cannot justify morals or ethics apart from autonomous human reason. So there's no objective source of morality or ethics out there. History is linear in naturalism and atheism. It is linear, it had a beginning, and it's going somewhere, but the question is where it's going. And again, change is typically viewed as an improvement due to evolution, so developments in history are the product of evolution. But history has no purpose, it has no teleos, it has no end in view. So yes, it's going somewhere, it had a beginning, it's going somewhere, but that somewhere is just a cold, dead universe, dead cosmos. So what are the core commitments in naturalism? There are none. Okay, naturalism doesn't have any inherent core commitments, unless perhaps you want to say survival of the fittest is its ultimate core commitment. Okay, so each person gets to choose for himself. Okay, now we're out of time, but you have it in your notes there. I've got some suggestions of things, questions you can ask to probe people who are atheists or who are naturalists, that you can probe and get them to think about their worldview and whether or not their worldview works. And you've got several, half a dozen or so questions there that are kind of thought starters, in addition to some of the questions we've already mentioned. Okay? So, well, we're way out of time, but that's atheism and naturalism. And so next week then we will go on and talk about what's called continuity or monism. Okay? Any questions?